S obzirom da nam broj učesnika evo još uvijek raste, ja predlažem da sačekamo 1 minutu.
Brankice, prevodite na BHS engleski.
Dobro jutro, dame i gospodo. Dobrodošli na webinar Poboljšanje kvaliteta zraka, mjere, planiranje i strategije. Ovaj webinar se održava u okviru izrade strategije zaštite okoliša Bosne i Hercegovine, Federacije Bosne i Hercegovine, Republike Srpske i distrikta Brčko. Sama izrada strategije je podržana od strane Kraljevine Švedske i danas su sa nama i predstavnici ambasade kao i stručnjaci koji su stavljeni na raspolaganje za izradu same strategije. Cilj webinara današnjeg je da učesnicima pruži informacije o planskim strategijama, reformama politike i primjerima iz drugih država sa naglaskom na najbolje prakse usmjerene na poboljšanje kvaliteta zraka. Na taj način ćemo dati doprinos da stručnjaci koji su angažovani na izradi strategije na osnovama participativnog pristupa kroz rad u radnim grupama dobiju dodatne ulaze kako bi poboljšali zajedno svi kvalitet same strategije. Dobili ste program i u skladu sa programom riječima dobrodošlice će nam se na početku obratiti ambasadorica Kraljevine Švedske u Bosni i Hercegovini, njena ekscelencija Johanna Strojenquist. Izvolite.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here with you this morning to introduce this webinar that will provide good examples on how to reduce air pollution from experts in EU member states. For Sweden, environment and climate are top priorities. We want to lead by example, and Sweden has set an ambitious goal to become one of the world's first fossil-free countries and to be climate neutral by 2045. And by 2040, all energy used in Sweden should be renewable. And to reach these goals, all actors in the Swedish society must contribute proactively to reduce emissions. Cooperation between state, the private sector and civil society is needed, and this is taking place. The climate crisis is an existential threat against all human beings, but also all other life on our planet. And the climate change and pollution that destroys our planet does not stop at borders, as we know. And that is why Sweden is engaging globally, working with others within the EU and the UN to achieve the goals set by the Paris Agreement. And this is also why we work with partners in Bosnia and Herzegovina to protect nature and combat climate change. Sweden is one of the world's biggest donors per capita to most existential multilateral climate funds. And here in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we are the largest bilateral donor in the field of environment. This webinar today is part of a larger project that has as an objective to develop an environmental strategy and plan for the whole of the country, for the whole of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And one aim of the project, among others, is to identify key challenges, objectives, and measures to improve air quality in the whole country. As you know, Bosnia and Herzegovina has a several decade-long problem of air pollution in most of its urban areas. Unfortunately, during the last decade, the situation has become worse, especially in bigger urban areas, due to the increased number of people moving to the cities from the rural areas. The air pollution outdoors is often high above prescribed limits, especially during the winter season. According to a survey by the World Health Organization, Bosnia and Herzegovina takes the 5th or 6th place in the world in terms of death per 100,000 people from consequences caused by polluted air. And according to the World Bank report on air pollution management in Bosnia and Herzegovina, every year approximately 3,300 people die prematurely because of the consequences of being exposed to the air pollution. So this is it's a very serious problem in this country. And as we know, the main sources of pollution are heating of houses and transport. And the heating with coal and wood are the main problems. And of course, this is due to the fact that a majority of the population cannot afford to use natural gas or modern equipment for heating, such as modern stoves or boilers on pellets and heat pumps. And transport results in significant pollution in urban areas due to the old age of vehicles and low level of infrastructure for public transport, as well as alternatives such as bike lanes, for example, if you don't want to use a vehicle to transport yourself. There is legislation in place, but it's not fully compliant with EU directives yet, and the monitoring of air quality is not developed enough. Some parts of the country is not covered by measurement stations, and there's no functional system for emission reporting. And so this means that there is no reliable data on emissions of pollutants. And this is, of course, the very basis. We know more or less where the pollution is coming from, but this needs to be developed. And this is one of the things that Sweden is supporting. There are more than 400 stakeholders involved in the development of the strategy and action plan that this project ESAP will develop. And they're involved through different working groups, and we think that such an approach will be with a wide group participating of experts and representatives of civil society, will create ownership and hopefully enable a successful implementation. And this strategy will and the plan, of course, when adopted and implemented, will be important for the health of the population in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but it will also be an important step in terms of EU integration. Because it will help and clearly set out what should be done to reach EU requirements in terms of air quality in the next 10 years. So this project and these documents will be extremely important to the country, and I'm happy that this webinar can be part of a discussion where also good examples from other countries can be used. So with those words, I would like to hand over to the experts and for us to listen to them. Thank you.
Hvala na uvodnim riječima njenoj ekscelenciji Johani Strömquist, ambasadorici Kraljevine Švedske u Bosni i Hercegovini. Mi idemo dalje sa programom. U skladu sa programom sada imamo uvodnu prezentaciju od strane mog kolege Gorana Trbića, koji zajedno sa mnom vodi na izradi strategije zaštite okoliša u Bosni i Hercegovini dio koji se tiče i kvaliteta zraka, klimatskih promjena i energije. Prije nego što dam riječ kolegi Trbiću, ukratko bih da predstavim današnji naš program koji traje do 11:30. Dakle, u ovom uvodnom dijelu ćemo čuti od strane kolege Gorana Trbića koji su to izazovi kada je u pitanju kvalitet zraka i šta smo to do sada uradili kroz 2 sastanka radnih grupa koje smo do sada održali u drugoj polovini prošle godine. Nakon toga ćemo čuti 3 prezentacije od eksperata koji dolaze iz Štokholmskog instituta za okoliš, a nakon toga ćemo otvoriti diskusiju. Vezano za diskusiju, a i samo praćenje, želim da dam samo kratke instrukcije za sve. Što se tiče praćenja, prezentacije od kolega sa SEI-a će biti na engleskom. Imate mogućnost na vašem Zoomu da uključite opciju Interpretation i da izaberete jedan od naših jezika, kako god ih nazivate, da čujete i simultani prevod. Što se tiče pitanja, nemate mogućnost glasovnog postavljanja pitanja, nego imate opciju Q&A, dakle u dnu vašeg izbornika, i kad tu kliknete onda možete da postavljate pitanja. Pitanja možete postavljati i za vrijeme samih prezentacija, tako da ćemo onda u drugom dijelu da počnemo sa odgovaranjima i sa diskusijom. Ja bih ujedno zamolio sve paneliste da se drže predviđenog vremena kako bismo imali dovoljno vremena i za diskusiju i kako bismo sve završili u predviđenom vremenu. Evo, ja sad pozivam kolegu Gorana Trbića da nam izloži stanje u Bosni i Hercegovini. Izvoli, Gorane.
Azrudine, hvala. Dobro jutro svima, vaša ekscelencijo, kolegice i kolege, dame i gospodo. Azrudine, da li je prezentacija na skrinu?
Jeste, izvoli.
Hvala. Kako je kolega Azrudin rekao, ovu prezentaciju pripremili smo nas dvojica na bazi analize stanja i na bazi prethodnih sastanaka radnih grupa. Jasno je da kvalitet vazduha u Bosni i Hercegovini jako loš, da je dosta zagađen. Najveći uzroci su svakako korištenje uglja i ogrjevnog drveta, tu su emisije iz industrijskih postrojenja, emisije iz saobraćaja i imamo još tu nepovoljan položaj, geografski položaj urbanih centara koje se nalaze u kotlinskom prostoru i naročito u tokom zimskih mjeseci, zbog toga se stvaraju i veći problemi sa zagađenjem. Najzagađeniji gradovi u tokom zimskih mjeseci u Bosni i Hercegovini su Sarajevo, Tuzla, Zenica, Banja Luka i Bijeljina. Što se tiče kvaliteta vazduha u federaciji...
Gorane, izvini, samo da uključiš full screen opciju. Full screen samo.
Ok.
Gore na slide show, pa. Ako je problem, može i ovako, ali evo na slide show ako možeš.
Pokušam, ali... Samo malo da...
Ok, vidi se. Izvinjavam se.
Ok. Da li sad?
Nije na full screen, ali nema veze, vidljivo je. Fino se vidi.
Ok, sad imam problema kod sebe ovdje, ali sad ćete mi ponovo. Ja se izvinjavam. Sad sam ja izgubio kod sebe ovdje na full screenu. Evo, može ovako. Jel se sad vidi?
Vidi.
Ok. Što se tiče Federacije Bosne i Hercegovine, ovlaštena institucija Federalni hidrometeorološki zavod koji vrši kontrolu i monitoring kvaliteta vazduha. Kontrola se vrši na oko 20 stanica. Mi smo napravili pregled stanja za 2019. godinu gdje je koncentracija sumpor dioksida premašena u Zenici, u Živinicama, koncentracija azotnog oksida imaju napravo određene prekoračenja u Sarajevu, koncentracija lebdećih čestica u vazduh PM10 i PM2,5 je gotovo premašila vrijednosti na svim stanicama, odnosno na svim mjernim mjestima. Ono što je dobro, ugljen monoksid je znatno ispod graničnih vrijednosti, također i ozon. Što se tiče Republike Srpske, ovlaštena institucija je Hidrometeorološki zavod Republike Srpske. Dominantna prekoračenja su u Ugljeviku, u Bijeljini i u Banja Luci. Kad kažem Ugljeviku i Bijeljini, mislim na sumpor dioksid i azotne okside, a suspendovane čestice PM10 i PM2,5 i u rafineriji Brodu, Banja Luci, Ugljeviku i Gacko. Ono što je interesantno, tokom 2019. godine nije zabilježeno prekoračenje od onih sulfida i benzena u rafineriji Brod, međutim rafinerija Brod nije radila tokom 2019. godine. U tom konačnom izvještaju, kad bude napravio neko presjek stanja u tu višegodišnjem nizu, tu se može očekivati da će i prekoračenje benzena biti nešto iznad dozvoljene granice. Što se tiče distrikta Brčko, u distriktu Brčko postoji mobilna stanica za praćenje kvaliteta vazduha, postoji na lokaciji u bescarinskoj zoni. Ona je opremljena analizatorima i meteorološkim analizatorima za mjerenje polutanata u vazduh i zabilježeno prekoračenje PM10 nekoliko puta u toku godine. Što se tiče najvećih emisija zagađujućih materija, ovo smo prikazali iz 4 najveća zagađivača, to su 4 najveće termoelektrane u Bosni i Hercegovini, Tuzla, Kakanj, Gacko i Ugljevik, gdje je koncentracija, govorim za 2014. godinu, gdje je koncentracija sumpor dioksida imala vrijednost od čak 273.000 tona godišnje, azotnih oksida oko 20.000 tona i čvrstih čestica oko 6.000 tona na nivou godine. Što se tiče ciljeva u oblasti kvaliteta vazduha, državni plan smanjenja NERP koji je usvojen 2015. godine, on je definisao određena smanjenja, a u fokus je stavio ovih 10 velikih postrojenja, kako sam rekao, ove 4 velike termoelektrane i njihove blokove. Implementacijom NERP-a očekuje se značajno smanjenje, pre svega sumpor dioksida za nekih 95%, te čvrstih čestica za oko 90%. Dobro je reći da već imamo pozitivne pomake po ovom pitanju, jer je i termoelektrana Ugljevik već nešto uradila na odsumporavanju. Što se tiče emisija sa gasova s efektom staklene bašte, Bosna i Hercegovina je dala svoj doprinos Parijskom klimatskom sporazumu i za te potrebe radila svoj prvi ANDC 2015. godine. Doduše, tad ambicije nisu bile velike, tad je planirano da do 2030. godine da se očekuje čak porast emisija GHG-a, međutim, trenutno je u fazi usvajanja drugi, odnosno NDC Bosne i Hercegovine, gdje su ambicije mnogo veće i gdje se očekuje smanjenje do 2030. godine negdje po bezuslovnom scenariju oko 12,8%, a u uslovnom scenariju 17,5%, ali u odnosu na baznu 2014. godinu. To znači još veće smanjenje ako gledamo u odnosu na 1990. godinu. I ono što je dobro, dalje se očekuje veća smanjenja, ako idemo tačnije do 2050. godine, smanjenje bi trebalo biti za nekih, odnosno vrijednosti oko 12 megatona CO2, što su svakako jako velike ambicije i nadam se da će Bosna i Hercegovina ići u ovom pravcu. Pored NDC-a i ANDC-a, jedna od obaveza Bosne i Hercegovine je izrada takozvanog nacionalnog energetskog i klimatskog plana, obaveze prema energetskoj zajednici i po ovom pitanju već ima duže od godinu dana Bosna i Hercegovina ušla u rješavanje ovog problema, odnosno izradu ovog dokumenta. U trenutnoj fazi je urađena analiza stanja i očekuje se tokom ove godine da će ovaj nacionalni energetski i klimatski plan biti usvojen i svi se nadamo da će ambicije biti i veće nego što su bile u NDC-u. Što se tiče pregleda izazova koji smo definisali na bazi ovih prethodnih sastanaka na jurisdikciji BiH i Republika Srpska i Federacija Bosna i Hercegovina, što se tiče postojeće infrastrukture, govorim o osnovnim izazovima, to je nerazvijena infrastruktura za električna vozila i nemotorizovane načine transporta, zatim razvijanje željezničkog transporta u odnosu na drumski, dalje izgradnja daljinskih grijanja i nerazvijen javni prevoz. Ima dosta izazova vezano za sisteme poticaja i za dekarbonizaciju. Jedna od tih su, recimo, da je sektor uglja još uvijek nepravedno subvencioniran umjesto projekata obnovljivih izvora energije i građanske energije, pa onda starost termoelektrana, energetske zadruge nisu prepoznate u zakonu, kako uspješno uvesti koncept građanske energije, onda opet dalje ukidanje subvencije za obnovljive izvore energije, subvencionisati samo projekte građanske energije i da ne postoji mehanizam finansiranja mjera energetske efikasnosti. Napominjem da su, znači, ovo samo okvir pregleda izazova, ove će izazovi biti još dopunjeni kasnije tokom izrade ovih dokumenata strateških. Što se tiče regulisanja tržišta kao pregled izazova, uočili smo, definisali da je energetski sistem centralizovan i da drži monopol nad potrošačima, da je nepriuštivost daljinskog grijanja, da nema svo stanovništvo, energetsko siromaštvo, te definisanje kvaliteta goriva i njegova kontrola i ispitivanje. Monitoring, po meni, jedan od najbitnijih izazova vezan za ovaj strateški dokument u poglavlju kvalitet vazduha, klimatske promjene i energija, gdje su jasno definisani na svim jurisdikcijama da je nedovoljan broj mjernih stanica i da je neadekvatna mreža mjernih stanica, znači postojeća mreža nije dovoljna i treba je unaprijediti u znatnoj mjeri, a to sve prega, mislim, kroz razvoj i jačanje kapaciteta hidrometeoroloških zavoda iz Sarajeva i iz Banja Luke. Dalje, energetska statistika nije dovoljno i razvijena i još uvijek imamo nedovoljnu informisanost o kvalitetu vazduha. Dalje, što se tiče postojećeg zakonodavstva i ispunjavanja obaveza, odnosno ciljeva po osnovu članstva u energetskoj zajednici i prema Europskoj uniji, još uvijek je prisutno netransparentno učešće javnosti u energetskim projektima u planiranju. Dalje, nastavak provedba NERP-a, usvajanje zakona o energetskoj efikasnosti, ti zakoni, iako postoje pravilnici, ne primjenjuju se dovoljno u praksi i nema destimulacije za stara vozila. Što se tiče prostornog planiranja, još uvijek ima neplansku gradnju u urbanim sredinama i nepostojanje planova sanacije, tako da je kvalitet vazduha dosta loš. Što se tiče emisija, kućna ložišta su još uvijek veliki zagađivači zraka uz ova industrijska postrojenja i evidentan nedostatak podrška donosioca odluka za smanjenje emisija GHG. I sad se nadam da ćemo kroz ovaj NDC i kroz NECAP da ćemo napraviti napredak i po ovom pitanju. I što se tiče intersektorske saradnje, pitanje i problemi klimatskih promjena, ali i kvaliteta vazduha nisu dovoljno integrisana u sektorske politike. Također definisali smo i okvirne preporuke. Namjerno govorimo ove okvire, tako da bi mogli kasnije preporuke da ih dopunjujemo, da ih dorađujemo, dodajemo nekakve nove. Ove su neke od najbitnijih, a to su ubrzati ispunjavanje postojećih ciljeva o smanjenju emisija u vazduh iz postrojenja za sagorijevanje, znači implementacija NERP-a i redovno prati nivo ispunjenosti tih ciljeva. Dalje, jačanje kapaciteta institucija koje su odgovorne za pitanje kvaliteta vazduha, klimatske promjene i energiju i ponovno apostrofiram da se to posebno odnosi na entitetske hidrometeorološke zavode, pošto prate i kvalitet vazduha, ali i meteorološki, odnosno klimatski monitoring u Bosni i Hercegovini i da se jasno odredi kvantifikovani ciljevi za 2030. godinu, kako sam to već naveo tamo u NDC-u, koji će biti dovoljno ambiciozni, uporedivi sa ciljevima Evropske unije, zemljama i okruženja, ali istovremeno realni i sprovodivi u praksi. Dalje, od nekih preporuka su usvajanje zakona o klimatskim promjenama u skladu sa Ustavom BiH i ovdje imamo pomak gdje Republika Srpska već je krenula sa izradom zakona o klimatskim promjenama, očekujemo tu na nivou federacije i na nivou BiH. Dalje, unaprijediti legislativni okvir za obnovljive izvore energije i energetsku efikasnost, uvesti nove mehanizme poticaja za obnovljive izvore energija i što je isto jako bitno da se uradi akcioni plan prilagođavanja klimatskih promjena i izgradnje kapaciteta za njegovo provođenje i ono što je isto jako bitno, a odnosi se gasova sa efektom staklene bašte, da se izradi plan postepenog uvođenja naknada za emisiju GHG-a i s ciljem pripreme za ulazak u EU ETS. I samim tim bi, kaže, da ušli na neki način uzbiljnije u proces dekarbonizacije. Znači, evo samo kaže ukratko ono što smo do sada uradili i kaže, naravno, tu smo na raspolaganju za sva buduća pitanja i da ovaj dokument zajedno radimo, kako smo rekli na početku, riječ je o participativnom pristupu gdje se očekuje i vaše učešće. Hvala vam.
Hvala, Gorane. Mislim da si odgovorio na izazov da izazove prezentuješ u 10 minuta. S obzirom na obim problematike u Bosni i Hercegovini, zaista je umijeće u 10 minuta spomenuti sve. Ako nešto nije ispomenuto u diskusiji, molim vas da postavite pitanje. A naravno i ovo što ste čuli, vjerujem da će vas postaći na neka od pitanja. Mi idemo dalje sa programom. Sljedeća prezentacija je priprema plana za poboljšanje kvaliteta zraka. Čućemo je od Eleni Mihailopolu. Ona dolazi nam iz Štokholmskog instituta za okoliš. Dio je grupe instituta koja se bavi kvalitetom zraka i napomenuo bih da ima jako dobro iskustvo u regionu, tako da vjerujem da će nam svima biti interesantno čuti šta nam Eleni ima da kaže. Pa izvolite.
Hvala. Dobro jutro. Dragi kolege, hvala vam na pozivu i što ste danas ovdje. Divno je biti danas s vama i imati priliku razgovarati o pitanjima oko zagađenja zraka i kreiranja politika. I will carry on with the rest of the presentation in English because I don't think it will be easy for me to do that. I'm sorry, I think my slides have changed. Okay, so something I will be talking about today is planning on action to reduce air pollutants, air pollution and emissions. This is the outline of the presentation, and I think these are some key issues that it's good to have in mind as I go through the slides. I will be talking a little bit briefly about SEI and the work that we do, the experience we have with air pollution, but after that introductory slide, what I would like to go through with you today is talk about air pollution and climate, issues in developing air pollution policy. This is something that it needs to be very much at the front of the discussion. How to develop a practical approach to managing air pollution, assessing emissions from key sectors. I will give some specific examples regarding transport and the residential sector, policies and strategies to implement the mitigation measures, but I would also like to give some country-specific examples. So the Stockholm Environment Institute is an international research and policy organization that tackles environment and development challenges. SEI has its quarters in Sweden, but there are centers in the UK, the US, Thailand, Kenya, Estonia, and Colombia. Myself, I'm from the SEI part of the University of York, and within SEI York, we are the Air Quality, Climate, and Environmental Change Group. Our work focuses on air pollution and climate change, but we also work quite a lot on combining mitigation and adaptation analysis with a focus on scenario development. The slide that you are looking at is showing the countries that we work with. SEI at the University of York is part of the CCAC coalition, and this is the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. And the kind of project, the initiative that we work under when we engage with the countries is called the SNAP initiative. And this is the Supporting National Action and Planning of Short-Lived Climate Pollutant initiative. I think it is important to say that these are only, I think that this is not a too recent slide. So these are only some of the countries that we are working with. And I think picking on something that Goran said, it's very important to highlight that we work together with national experts from those countries. Hopefully I will have a chance to go back to the way we work with the countries at a later slide. So the kind of work that we do is we work with local experts and national experts to develop integrated air quality and climate planning. Sometimes we use that, sometimes we do that using a specific tool, which we refer to as the model LEAP IBC, and LEAP IBC stands for Low Emissions Analysis Platform Integrated Benefits Calculator. And yes, as you can see, there is a wide range of countries that we have been working with over the last years. The part of the work that we do, both SAI and the CCAC Secretariat, is often used to provide guidance and support the enhancement of the NDCs, especially when it comes to integrating air pollution into national plans. I have been very lucky to participate in some of that work that we have done recently, and I must say that it has been an exceptionally interesting process. It has been amazing to see how this can work in different national contexts, and it's always interesting to see the different limitations and how these can be lifted in every situation. As I said in the beginning, it's always nice to think of the limitations and the issues of a problem quite far ahead in time. So while air pollution is a very important issue, and of course we will talk about the impacts in the next slide, but because of its effect on human health, food security, but also the environmental impacts that it can have, there are a lot of countries that are now putting it explicitly into their plans, into their strategies and policies, and they aim to tackle and alleviate the impacts. However, the formulation of the air quality policies is often complicated by the multiple species that are grouped together under the term air pollution. The spatial scale on which air pollutants can cause their impacts. So, for example, we heard from Ambassador Storkmist as well about how it does not confine itself to borders. So there are long-range transport issues. There are air quality issues related to specific localities and characteristics of the neighborhood of the city. And then there is the national and then the regional scale that we must take into consideration. There is a large number of source sectors as well. And in the analysis that I will show you in the next slides, you will see that the different sectors that are responsible for some pollutants or greenhouse gases, they can also be broken down into different subsectors. So sometimes we can end up with quite a complicated and large system that we need to tackle and deal with. However, because there are these complexities and because the analysis can become so difficult, there are a variety of strategies and approaches that have been adopted in order to develop air quality plans and policies in different parts of the world. I don't want to tire you with something that you all probably already know. However, it is always important to highlight that there are strong linkages between air quality and climate pollution and climate change, apologies. The sources can be common, the impacts can be common. So when we are looking into air pollution and when we are looking into climate change, they can often be considered as different levels of one same problem, one same challenge that we have to deal with. In terms of pollutants and their impacts, the biggest policy driver is always the impact air pollution has on health. The next slide has some more specifics on health. However, there are also impacts on the environment related to crop yields, biodiversity. There are impacts on the economy, on labor productivity, tourism, crop losses, but there are also other impacts like lost school days, damage to cultural monuments. I'm Greek. I come from Athens, and the damage to cultural monuments, I remember from when I was younger in the 90s. It was one of the key issues that was highlighted in the news, that the cultural heritage was very much in danger because of our air pollution issues. There is an interesting point to highlight here, that the impacts are not just separated from each other. So you don't just have the impact of the key pollutants to health. If the economy is impacted, and as we saw with COVID, for example, you will have a second layer of impacts going back to health. So the impacts themselves are interacting and overlapping. In terms of the key pollutants, when we're talking about health, we often focus on particulate matter, specifically PM2.5. We focus on ozone and nitrogen dioxide. But I will change the slide so that I don't run out of time. Goran said that we need to consider the participatory approach, and he did mention the word participatory several times. So this is a very important point. It is always important to express what we can gain from reducing air pollution in the different ways that people can relate to that. So air pollution and air pollutants, greenhouse gases and SLCPs, they are not just an academic issue, they're not just a theoretical issue. So they need to be expressed in a way that we can all understand how much they can impact our lives and our health. So these are some of the health-related impacts, for example, and these are impacts that go above and beyond the premature mortality that is recorded in the different areas based on the level of pollution. So we're looking at a relationship between preterm births and PM2.5, low birth weight, childhood pneumonia, asthma emergency room visits, non-fatal heart attacks, strokes, bronchitis. And these also relate to the impacts that we saw before, both on the economy and the general well-being of the population, of course. So in order to develop a practical approach, when we say the word measure, an air pollution measure, we refer to a very particular action that can be implemented in a particular source or sector to reduce air pollutant emissions from the specific source. Based on international and national assessments, there is a large body of evidence that has identified relevant air pollutant mitigation measures, which I will be showing you in some tables in a few minutes. However, it is very important to map, understand, and consider the local context, the local needs and priorities, and this includes the sort of development, and even it includes the wider discussion that the different stakeholders can have with each other. The development of this practical approach can be summarized. I do apologize. I know these are quite a lot of bullet points and it's very early in the morning. So the goals and desires and targets need to be specified and need to be specified quite clearly. Understanding the information related to air pollution and which air pollutants are important and key, and how we can quantify emissions from each source is also extremely important. We need to develop scenarios to understand how the sectors and their emissions are likely to change into the future. There is one more slide about that. And we also need to develop an understanding of how emissions link to pollution levels in cities, but also the country as a whole. To understand the levels of impacts caused is also another important point. We need to identify the measures that can reduce the emissions, and we need to quantify as far as possible the multiple benefits. And if it is possible, we need to identify the integrated benefits. Finally, again, a very important point, we need to identify all the relevant stakeholders and engage with those stakeholders early in the process. When we are talking about policymaking, we do need to consider, again, the different contexts. We need to consider the national contexts, but we also need to consider international contexts. Things like the LERTAP Convention, the EU air quality policy, EU climate policy, UNFCCC. This is all very important. It's a very important part of this discussion and this dialogue and this consideration. This is the air quality management cycle, and it shows how the key activities, it shows those key activities that we can use to develop a practical approach. The goals that need to be set, as it was shown in the previous slide, the identifying the emissions from the contributing sources and hopefully quantifying those emissions. The amount of emission reduction needs to be agreed to achieve goals. This can be done in different ways. This can be something that is discussed between the experts. Then we move on to the planning, the strategies and policies that need to be put in place. And finally, there needs to be some sort of monitoring of the progress that is made. So I must say that this is one of my favorite slides, and the reason why it's one of my favorite slides is because I've seen how well it can work when we are working together with the different countries. The type of approach that we take is that when we are looking into the different assessments, when we are working with the countries to produce the different reports, we take a very specific approach, and this is to start by seeing the data that is available and identifying base year and historical data. In some cases, we do that through reviewing high-level documents, so it can be World Bank documents or other very high-level reports. Sometimes there are national documents that can provide us with this type of information. And then what I find the most exciting in this process is that we move on to establishing the baseline scenarios. And then finally, we move to considering the mitigation options. There is a very specific example on work that we did with Serbia that I will be showing you in a moment. But what I found very useful about this structure is that it provides this very solid plan and way forward. It helps map the priorities, the different levels of the problem, the sectors, and the way this can be projected into the future can be used in quite a lot of different ways. This slide that relates to the transport sector is one of the tables that measures specific to the transport sector are applied globally. So this is just a compilation of measures that have been found to work when it comes to reducing emissions from the transport sector. We can see that the sector is broken down into emitting subsectors. So for example, passenger transport, road freight, and then the main pollutants are identified, end of pipe measures, but also changes in technology, practices, and fuel shift, and measures affecting demand for the polluting activity. There are quite a lot of these tables, and this one has more sectors included in this. It also has the residential sector, the industry, and agriculture. Of course, these are not sectors that are relevant to every country that we work with. But for the majority, for the most part, yes, we always go back to these tables and apply them in the national context in collaboration with the national experts, of course. Just one more slide on the same issue, just to extend it to show the waste management and the waste sector as well. I think I've got very few slides left. So in terms of policies to implement measures, these can be grouped under 5 categories. We have the regulatory approaches, we have the planning approaches, informational approaches to increase awareness, economic or market-driven approaches, and then there are the voluntary approaches. And I'm sure that you can understand that these are relevant to one or more stakeholders and anyone who engages with this type of discussion. When it comes to the regulatory approaches, and again, I please accept my apologies for the busy slide. The approach includes rules or standards to define allowable levels of emissions. And a typical example of that is the emission standards that there are for vehicles. The economic or market-driven approaches, a typical example of those is an emissions trading scheme. When it comes to the planning approaches, we often see things like transport-oriented urban planning that reduces travel activity and distances traveled. There is one more slide on that. And then we look at the informational approaches to increase awareness. This can be done in quite a lot of different ways, by disseminating information to the public in easily accessible formats, or by looking into different types of behavior change, or anything that can generate the momentum to drive change forward on a different level. Finally, we have, of course, the voluntary approaches, which typically involve the different agreements between private companies or industry association or even government agencies. It's always useful to consider the different implementation pathways that would need to be adopted and that would lead to implementation of specific measures and thus reduce the different emissions. And this is the slide I will be showing you in a moment on Serbia. The implementation is facilitated by the different policies that can be used to promote these measures, which was outlined briefly in the previous section. But I really want to highlight again that something that is very important to consider are the organizational aspects in terms of the implementation pathways and the intersectoral and cross-institutional collaboration and ways forward. Very often when we are working with a country, we find that we have to involve quite a lot of ministries, quite a lot of institutions, and this is very interesting because you can draw information from lots of different places, and then your planning and the way forward, it always becomes easier. So the work that we've done with the Serbian experts was around their assessment of short-lived climate pollutant mitigation. And what I would like to show you here is that we worked with data from their LERTAP convention submission. But what is very interesting to see is that when we are using this approach and when the sectors and the sources are broken down in this way, there can be a very clear understanding of the key sources and the key sectors and the key pollutants. What I found, again, extremely interesting and extremely useful to work with as part of the work with the Serbian experts was putting together this matrix, the mitigation matrix, with the national priorities, with the different prioritization levels, the different implementation of policies, and the administrative barriers that the experts wanted to put forward and present as part of the discussion. I think that this slide shows how the previous slides that were a bit more general can be implemented on a country-specific example and country-specific case. Hopefully, this type of approach, as you can see, that it has a time horizon from 2020 to 2050. This can allow for monitoring the impact, the progress, even the change in the national plans and the national priorities. I have one more slide, and I think this is my last one, because no, that is not my last slide. I do apologize. But we often talk about the integrated policies, and there was something that happened very recently in Athens that I found very interesting myself. So the mayor of Athens, he rolled out a project that was called the Great Walk of Athens. And while it was not specific to addressing air pollution, Athens does have quite a lot of air pollution coming predominantly from the transport sector. So the Great Walk was a plan to pedestrianize a big part of the city, to change some of the bus routes, to change the habits and the behavior of the citizens in the center of Athens. And that the Great Walk also came with a budget attached to it. Of course, it was quite a lot of, it was a big investment. However, a few weeks after it was implemented and everything was put in place and the pedestrianization had happened, there were quite a lot of problems that became obvious in Athens. The traffic was, the congestion of traffic was just moved to other points of the city. There were quite a lot of difficulties with the buses, with the bus routes, and it created an overall negative sentiment, despite the fact that it looked very nice. You know, there was quite a lot of green, and in the center of Athens, we don't have that. But so while it was, and eventually it had to be removed. So the entire project was rolled out and then had to be removed. So when now I think of the word integrated and measure and policy and mitigation option, I always go back to what happened with the Great Walk of Athens. It was a fantastic idea. It could have made the center of Athens look amazing. This could have contributed to the tourism, to the development of the city. But because it was not part of a greater strategy, of a greater plan, this created quite a lot of problems very, very fast.
Eleni, sorry for interruption, but please try to finish short.
Yes, I will skip this slide and I will just move to that final one. Just to say that by working in this way with the countries that we work with, there is a lot of opportunities to increase the mitigation ambition. And I think this is something that Goran also mentioned. And I will finish with this slide. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hvala Eleni za prezentaciju pristupa poboljšanju kvaliteta zraka i posebno hvala na konkretnim primjerima i vjerujem da ćete u vezi toga imati i vi konkretna pitanja. Malo smo u zaostatku sa vremenom nekih 10-15 minuta, pa ja molim preostala dva panelista da ako ništa budu u onom predviđenom vremenu. Sljedeća prezentacija je opći pregled iskustva u procesu pristupanja EU s naglaskom na kvalitet zraka u Estoniji. Ja pozivam gospodina Laureja Tamiste, koji je direktor SEI Tallinn centra i koji ima bogato iskustvo u kreiranju i upravljanju programima energetske efikasnosti i inovacija, da prezentuje ovu temu. Izvolite.
Yes, thank you very much, and hopefully it will work. So thank you for inviting me, and listening to your experience and the previous presentations, I feel there's so many similarities. The story is really familiar to me. I think Estonia has started with the same problems and undergone I think a long and interesting story of transition, and I will try to share some of the lessons learned from that kind of our journey in improving air quality and curbing the emissions. So how did it all start? Next slide, please. So in 1991, Estonia marks this year the 30 years of regaining the independence after collapse of Soviet Union, and we started out with huge environmental problems and legacy of pollution from Soviet time. So we had air pollution from Soviet-style heavy industries. Next slide. We had one of the most CO2 intensive energy sectors in the whole world, because perhaps people don't know it, but Estonia used and still uses a little bit local oil shale. It's a fossil rock, which is even dirtier than coal. So burning oil shale and producing electricity and oil shale oil, it's even dirtier than using coal. And we had huge whole national energy infrastructure built on that fossil. Next. But it wasn't only air quality. We had, environmental problems in all sectors. We had a huge, for example, legacy of Soviet military pollution. So Russia had military bases in Estonia, and there was no environmental standards. Everything was going straight into the nature. So there was, every possible pollution type you can think of, we had it, and in big quantities. Next slide. And also we had, problems with hazardous waste, and we had, also a nuclear submarine base in Estonia and nuclear waste issues. So really, really difficult position to start in 1991. Next. And the waste system, it wasn't functioning. Similarly, like air pollution kind of management systems. Next one. But how is it going now, 30 years later? Next. This is, no, one back, please. So how's it going now? And although the numbers are really small on the screen, perhaps, what is the message is that compared to 1990, by 2018, in most of, whether we are looking at the NOx or whether we are looking at the sulfur dioxide, whether we are looking at fine particles, whether we are looking at black carbon, actually, in most of those areas, there has been a drop of 60%, 64%, 53%, 45%, and so on. So a really significant drop in major air pollutants. Next one. And also the greenhouse gas emissions have dropped. And even more recently, 2019, there was a significant drop in CO2 emissions. And in 2020, even further reductions in CO2 emissions, which were related very much to European emission trading system and the CO2 price increasing in that European system. So all these trends have been going on. And very importantly, share of renewable energy has been growing as well, very much. So mostly the fastest growth has been in wind energy, but also biomass energy. We have combined heat and power plants in all of the major cities. So it's providing district heating, but also producing electricity. And 2020, we had a record growth in solar panels. I think more than 300 megawatts of solar panels were installed in Estonia. So, and what is now the result of it is that mostly the air quality is good. Not always, not in all cities, especially Tallinn, which is the capital city, biggest city, and closer to these oil shale areas in northeastern part of Estonia. There are times and periods and regions where you have air quality being either moderate or bad. But overall, you would say still that there has been a significant improvement. And very often, I remember the Estonian debate, all the environmental standards, or they will somehow, hinder the economic growth, and we should, get rich first, and then let's talk about the environment. So probably you have the similar debate. So the answer, was it at the expense of economy? The short answer is no. Actually, it wasn't. Next slide. If you look at all the kind of critical numbers, then actually there has been, in addition to this environmental transformation, there has been also economic transformation. So the GDP growth has been very fast. There has been clearly, of course, there was the 2008 global economic downturn, but if you look, then really the GDP kind of from the 6,000 something euro level to more than 20,000 euro per capita. Or if you look at the average wage, which is in the middle, the small graph, we started, the national average wage was below 200 euros in 1990. Now it's more than 1,400. So, and Estonia ranks #1 in tax competitiveness index in the world. If you look at the e-government solutions, different technological kind of rankings, Estonia again ranks really high. So it has been overall kind of transformation story. But what have been the key drivers to this success? Next one. So yes, one part is clearly the economic restructuring. I mean, the big inefficient Soviet-style industries, very many of them, you know, collapsed or phased out or had to reinvest into new technologies, better technologies, find new markets, new competitive niches. Then also there was a huge decrease in the agricultural sector and very big increase in kind of knowledge-intensive services. Estonia is now very strong and, you know, very digital. We have IT companies which are export-oriented, working globally, attracting foreign investment. This is all part of it, kind of changing the economic structure into cleaner, more innovative, knowledge-intensive sectors as well. And definitely this is, I think, an issue or challenge for your country, that not only to deal with the current environmental issues in whatever domain, but it's also about changing the business models. Really, the green economy, it's not a, you know, kind of hype word. It's a reality. Global markets are changing. All the investors, all the clients, they are demanding and want sustainable businesses to work in a sustainable fashion. If you're export oriented, not only working on domestic market, it's a must. You have to do it, and it will bring along also the positive environmental changes through that pressure from export markets. But obviously, you need to complement that with other policies as well. So I would say the carrot and the stick, as they say in English, was there. Definitely the EU joining pre-accession processes and joining was a very fundamental. Can you go back a little bit? So the EU accession meant that we had to kind of revamp or get our legislative requirements all to the European level, meaning introducing several new and limitations, regulations in place, and this puts a strong pressure again to change the practices in business sector as well. But it wasn't only requirements; it was also very strong support, financial support. Both throughout the 90s, there was a support from international donors, but we also had a benefit of kind of environmentally thinking neighbors. Finland and Sweden both provided assistance back then towards the environmental programs and the investments to create kind of environmental infrastructure. And then it was also, in addition to that, very important to put in place a transparent and well-functioning governance system, because you can have the best strategies in the world. Strategy is important. It's important to think out what is your focus is, how do we solve. But strategy is nothing without a good implementation. So you need to have the tools and organizational kind of setup for implementation. And I think Estonia managed to do that quite well. Next slide. So yeah, as I was saying, the carrot and stick part, that if you look at the kind of historical development, then the early 2000s, this was the key time when most of kind of important legislative acts were introduced, and really there was a wide-ranging then investments. We had several. We had international donors, but we had FARE, we had LIFE, we had this Norway grants, EU structural funds. But what was also important, Estonia introduced the national kind of own environmental taxation system, and these revenues went also back to financing environmental projects. so it was everything: water quality, it was the waste quality, it was the air quality, but it was also forestry, it was environmental education and awareness. So there was a national fund created, a national agency for environmental investments. And actually before SCI, I worked for 4 years there, financing these kind of solving environmental problems. Yes, next slide, please. And the governance system, as I was saying, you need good strategy, but even more so, I think you need a very good kind of governance system. So what Estonia currently has is that you have the Ministry of Environment that is responsible for creating the legal framework, representing Estonia at the EU level, and then transposing the legislative directives and other legal instruments into national legislation. Then, very importantly, you have an environmental board who is responsible for permits and compliance check. And there it's also very important that we have now the system in place where, whenever you plan to invest into a new, whether it's industry or energy infrastructure, that most likely will pollute, then you need to get a permit for that. You need to set out the parameters within which you have to abide, and then you report every year. And you are being checked whether you comply or not. And then there's also environmental agency who is responsible for kind of monitoring, analysis, doing the statistics, doing the air quality monitoring and the networks regarding that. And then, as I was saying, also, I think a vital part of that system is that there has been for more than 20 years now environmental investment center, through which all these kind of grant programs have been financed. That has been, I think, very crucial for making the change happen, because very many things, indeed, it's not realistic to expect that all the private households do the investments or the companies do the investments if it's currently cheaper to use the dirtier technology still. And if I look back, if I compare, for example, the case of Estonia, why Estonia has perhaps been in certain aspects quicker through the transformation than some other countries who started from 1991 in similar position, or if you look at the Bulgaria or Romania or some other country, then I think that the commitment to that we work on expertise based, that we don't try to politicize every decision or politicize kind of, I don't know, these funding agencies, that it's expertise based and really no tolerance for corruption, working on that. If you look at the international rankings, Estonia is one of the least corrupt of the kind of former Soviet sphere. So I think this kind of that, let's set aside the political or, who knows who, which is it's obviously, it was a thing in the 90s in a small country setting. Connections always matter, but kind of the commitment that we will, not take advantage of that, and we will commit to the kind of expertise and merit-based system. I think this is actually also very important part why Estonia also has been very successful in implementing, for example, EU structural funds. And if you look at this, because not all countries can, there's a lot of funding that EU gives to member states and those in the catching up and transition phase. And not all countries can manage to absorb and use these funds. They get, the pace is too slow, they get somehow stuck in a bureaucracy. But in Estonia, you see historically one of the highest rates again of the funds used. And I think this is because of that, commitment. Can we go one slide back? just to mention some of the things, perhaps this is of interest how we tackle, because it was very much the air pollution in Estonia was related to energy sector and transport as well, but the heating part was and the electricity part was very big. So on electricity side, it was kind of enforcing the national requirements, setting limits to pollution allowed. But then on a heating level and cities level, it was kind of really focusing on the district heating side, because this is what you can change and get a fast impact. So in most of Estonian cities by now, all the district heating has been switched to biomass and switched away from heavy oil or coal usage, and also phasing out gas. And putting in place in modern technologies, and then also improving the efficiency, improving the piping, because there were many losses. So if you decrease the losses, you decrease the need for burning fuel. Also improving the energy efficiency, because again, the more energy efficient is your housing stock, the less you need to use primary energy to fuel that. But also there have been direct, not only district heating, but the house is not connected to district heating, like bigger apartment housing, installation of modern either heat pumps or solar technologies. Then there has been also to private households, different investment support programs, but very often also linked to energy efficiency. And then on transport side, there has been kind of switching to biomethane buses, so it's local renewable fuel and cleaner than diesel. Now there has been, in recent years, there has been also electric vehicle infrastructure creation, electric vehicle subsidy program. So historically, that has been through different phases, but it all started out from really strong focus on district heating. But now, over the last 5 years, there has been much wider range of programs, also looking at industry, energy efficiency in the industry, because as you solve some of the big bits, then you go to the smaller sources of pollution. But this is how we started out, by taking the biggest air pollution sources, focusing with the programs and legislation on them. And as these changes occur, then going to the smaller bits. But then I would say the next 10 years for Estonia, definitely an issue is rather a better city planning, that you would have less of this forced mobility. If you have bad city planning or bad public services planning, then you have to drive your kids to the kindergarten or to school at the other end of the city, or commuting back and forth. And when you can do the better planning of the services, then you start also cutting away one part, additional part of the solution. But this is kind of, I would say, the next challenges for Estonia. Next slide. And next. So this has been the story of Estonia, and I'm really confident that if we could do it, you could easily do it as well. So I wish everyone success with it, and happy to support it if needed. Thank you.
Hvala, Lauri. Mislim da smo čuli jako korisne informacije sa konkretnim mjerama i naglaskom na neke od bitnih aspekata za uspjeh pristupa poboljšanju kvaliteta zraka, i siguran sam da smo se pronašli u tim od nekih aspekata, kao što je slušati struku, a isključiti svaku mogućnost i svaku opciju korupcije u ovom segmentu. Vjerujem da ćemo imati i pitanja za gospodina Laurija, s obzirom da, kao što je prezentovano, možemo dosta naučiti iz iskustva Estonije, s obzirom da neko početno stanje smo imali manje više isto, ali naravno ustavno uređenje Bosne i Hercegovine je posebno, i u tom smislu ne možemo kopirati, ali dosta možemo naučiti. Ja pozivam sljedećeg panelistu, gospodina Kristijana Nagla, koji dolazi iz Agencije za životnu sredinu Austrije, da nam prezentuje prezentaciju pod naslovom Planovi i mjere za poboljšanje kvaliteta zraka, postojeći primjeri najboljih praksi. Izvolite, evo imamo već pitanja u QA. Dok prezentacija počne, ja ću da iskoristim tu priliku da još jednom pozovem sve da pitanja postavljaju u QA. Hvala.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the introduction. As Mr. Husika said, I work for the Environment Agency in Austria, and I'm also part of the EPPA, the Environmental Partnership Program for Accession program, where Bosnia is also a member, and colleagues from Bosnia took part in the workshops we conduct under the EPPA project. And one workshop dealt also with air quality directive, and where I presented some thoughts about air quality plans and measures, current good practice examples in Europe. So next slide, please. So I will shortly talk about some general considerations. You already heard a little bit about it or a lot from Lauri and from my previous speakers, Eleni and Goran. Also, interaction with climate measures is extremely important, and then some panels and guidance documents on European level and activities of European institutions, and good practice examples for domestic heating, as this is an important source in Bosnia, but also awareness raising is important to really push policy makers. And finally, a little bit about traffic awareness raising, learning from the COVID-19 pandemic, and also a nice project also from France about it's for climate, but I think what we can learn from this project is valid for air quality as well. So next slide, please. If air quality has to be improved, it's important, especially when we talk about particulate matter, that we have an engagement on all levels. So this is an example of Croatia model calculations where PM concentration levels come from. So we have international contributions, we have national, we have urban, and we have local contributions. So all these different levels have to work together. For NO2 and SO2, it's mainly urban or local, but still the framework, the legislation is mainly most often done on a national level. So also here, the cooperation is important. Next slide, please. We already heard about the importance of climate policies, and these are largely beneficial for air quality. So a recent calculation for the European Union, for the 27 European member states, has shown that if we implement strict climate measures on European level, so if we transform our energy system from fossil fuels to clean and renewable sources, there will be no further costs for air quality measures in 2050. On the contrary, we have a large benefit for air quality, for public health. Next slide, please. So some general guiding principles for air quality measures is that it's, first of all, the emissions should be reduced at the source. So in a factory, the vehicles should be cleaner, the household heating should be cleaner. The next step of less importance is that the concentrations should be reduced. That can be done, for example, by noise barriers, and the least optimum or the approach would be to reduce the exposure. So to tell people to avoid certain areas, to stay inside, or to avoid busy roads and things like that. So this is certainly the least preferable option. Next slide, please. So overall, the guiding principles we have seen in the recent years to be important is that the pollutants, different pollutants like PM10 as particulate matter or sulfur dioxide, they should be tackled together. And it's important to cooperate with different authorities, with neighboring communities to learn from each other. But measures should be certainly taken at that level where it's most efficient. And as climate change is a major driving force, it's important to have coherent approaches between all different policies, between climate change, transport, energy, noise, quality of life, so that always the same data is used, and that the measures don't contradict each other. Health data is important to find political support, and in general, strong political support and public support is important for the successful implementation, as we have heard from the previous speaker as well. And indicators to monitor your success for individual measures and for your overall plan is also an important success factor. And one has to keep in mind that the main goal to improve air quality is to improve public health and not only comply with the limit value at a certain air quality monitoring station. And we also have to keep in mind that data will never be perfect. So, but reduction of air pollutants is always beneficial for human health. So we can't wait until the data is better, but we can act already now. So next slide, please. Thanks. So there's, as said, and we have already heard about some programs, there's a lot of examples available in Europe. So what I will present is just a subjective selection of some of this vast amount of material available. And it certainly is important that this is also what the workshop here is about, to learn from the experience from other countries. And it's also important to see that really courage is necessary, that trials and experiments are useful tools. So failures are possible, but this should not discourage anyone from implement measures and try different approaches. Next slide, please. So one source of interesting material is the expert panel for clean air in cities, which has been implemented under the UNECE Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution, as people have seen that there are similar problems in many cities throughout the world. So for example, domestic heating is a major focus in many cities and regions. Ammonia reduction helps also to reduce urban background levels and things like that. So next. So there has already been 2 workshops within these expert panels, and all the presentations are available. And you can find the links in the presentation. Also, another interesting program by the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. The JRC is currently developing air quality management guidelines. So to summarize the existing knowledge, to identify key challenges for different regions and cities throughout Europe, and also to establish the link between the particular measure then how are the changes for, how does this affect the emission of this of a specific source, and how does that change then the exposure of the population, as this data is still in Europe also not available. So next slide, please. And so, and the JRC guidance document also tries to identify some key challenges that many countries and regions in Europe face. So this is, for example, the quantification of measures. So there are uncertainties regarding the emissions, the compliance, when will we comply with the limit values, what are the health impacts, and also reliable scenarios and projections for air quality concentrations, for emissions, how will they develop in future. It's not easy to get. And also source apportionment for particulate matter, really to have a quite certain, so this helps to identify the most cost-effective measure. So for that, you need to know what sources contribute how much to your PM levels. And also these guidance documents try to cover some general issues, such as ensuring that there will be really a green recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, and so that all the money that is now put into subsidies, that this is used to really change our way of life towards a more greener and less polluting one. Next slide, please. So domestic heating, this is certainly a source that is often underestimated by public. Industry, traffic, so this is more often named as the major sources for air pollution, but domestic heating, especially wood burning or coal burning, is often underestimated, but also that the data quality is much worse compared to traffic. It's often not clear what fuel is used, how much of the fuel is used, and in which appliances. And further problem is that we have long renewal cycles of heating systems, and there's also social issues, because often poor people have to use low quality fuels as they are cheaper. Some good practices are, of course, awareness campaigns, because the operation of the manual appliances is crucial for the emissions. Maintenance, inspection is also important, and if you ban solid fuel for climate change, it's better not to change to another fossil fuel, but shift immediately to zero emission technologies. Okay, next slide, please. And one nice example of an awareness raising project was done by the steering colleagues, who showed how the user can influence the emission. And for that, they built a domestic heating demonstration laboratory. Next slide, please. With which they went to small villages where wood burning is predominant, and people could experiment with different heating systems and install sensors to see what is the impact of different ways to operate the heating system. Next slide, please. And they also prepared a small device and smartphone app so that the users can monitor their heating behavior and to build up a database and to see what is the impact if they change their behavior. Next slide, please. Another very interesting awareness raising program, which I think is also, in general, awareness raising is important to really to get public and political support for the implementation of measures. And so the participation of public and the stakeholders is key and element for success. And this is, I think, also what this project is about. And one of such an example is the so-called Curious Noises, or the Curious Noses project in Antwerp, where citizens monitored NO2 levels with the help of very cheap devices. And that clearly gave a much better picture of the NO2 pollution in Antwerp, and it clearly showed that the official data did not cover some of the NO2 hotspots within the city. So next slide, please. Yes, thanks. And one very interesting example is the French Citizen Convention on Climate, and with this had the goal. This has the goal to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions to 40% until 2030. And what they did, they randomly selected 150 citizens throughout France, and this convention was supported by a governance committee, by technical and legal experts, by professionals in city participation and guarantors to oversee the neutrality and sincerity of the debates. And this next slide, please. And this convention had 7 sessions, so to inform the citizens about the problem, and then to find solutions and to finalize the study. Next slide, please. And in last summer, a report was published with in total 150 general proposals, so a lot of material. So this convention was very active and covering traffic, consumption, housing, work production. And I think the most interesting thing here is that the convention came up with measures that were maybe thought beforehand it's politically not possible to implement such measures, but the citizen thought that this is these are the most effective measures, so we have to implement them. And for example, such measures are a general speed limit of 100 kilometers per hour on motorways, and massive investment to modernize the infrastructure, and end of domestic flights within France in 4 years' time, and ban of marketing of high-emitting vehicles. So these are, I think, very interesting examples which maybe politicians would not allow to propose. Next slide, please. And okay, this is already, hopefully this is the next slide. No, yeah, previous slides, please. Sorry, I was not sure if it's already the next slide. So, and also for housing and buildings, all boilers, all oil and coal boilers have to be changed until 2030, which is in 9 years, in new and renovated buildings. And they also encourage to limit the use of heating and air conditioning, so less to make the rooms cooler during winter time and less and warmer during summertime to save energy. And also the development of peri-urban shopping areas, which is an important driver for traffic. And so to summarize, what this approach has shown is that a well-prepared and a well-conducted process with clear objectives can really lead to very surprising, far-reaching results. Next slide, please. So, and what the COVID pandemic has also already been mentioned, and what we can learn here is that some measures that have been part of air quality plans for long but never been really implemented were now implemented very fast. So to replace flight traveling by video conferences, temporary bike lanes and also the start of the redistribution of public space to allow for keeping a safe distance. And of course, home office. is much more widespread than it is before. But as said, a green recovery will be crucial to avoid lock-in effects when we put all the money into the economy. Next slide. And one nice example maybe of kind of experiment to change public space was done in Vienna last summer, where a swimming pool was built between two very busy roads, and to allow for a new view how public space can be used. Okay, next, yeah, thanks. And also another interesting example is that the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, was re-elected in 2020 with a clear focus on ecology, solidarity, and engagement. So, and with a far-reaching bicycle program and a far-reaching program which aims at giving priority for pedestrians instead of cars. Next slide, please. The same holds true for the Berlin Mobility Law, which was introduced in 2018, and which was based on an initiative by one single person who wanted to shift the focus from the car-centered mobility to an overall mobility. So the main elements are really to shift to a general view on mobility, to safety, to road safety, to inclusion, and to quality of life, and to redistribute the public space so that also the active modes of transport and the environmental friendly mobility has enough space within a city. And finally, one example from Sweden, which is in that sense of interest, as they made a framework for long-term planning of environmental zones. So it was clear that when a city implements an environmental zone for vehicles above 3.5 tons, then until a certain date, which is known many years before, the owner of these trucks and buses are not allowed to enter the cities anymore. So this really helps to have a long-term planning, which is important for commercial facilities. Next slide. Urban traffic, as said, some general views on that. There's a European platform that provides a vast amount of successful examples of sustainable urban mobility plans. And we really have to think about shifting of the car-centered thinking towards mobility needs and promote active transport modes, which is good for health anyhow. A special problem are diesel vehicles, as they are very dirty up to Euro 5 when it comes to nitrogen oxide emissions. So it's important not to use the old vehicles that are banned maybe in some Western European countries, and then import those vehicles and use them within your country. Okay, this brings me to the final slide to summarize and conclude. So there's a large number of European, national and regional examples available. Data gaps and uncertainties should not hamper the implementation of the measures. So you should not wait for the perfect data, and citizen involvement is an important tool to achieve acceptance. And the COVID measures has shown that change is possible within a very short period of time. And this ongoing discussion about the redistribution of public space, which is, I think, important for air quality as well, goes on in many cities in Europe. Okay, thanks. And I only have to say that I have to leave in 10 minutes. So if you have questions, please ask them now or send me an email. Then I will certainly try to answer your question.
Hvala Kristijane. vjerujem da je i ostalim učesnicima kao i meni bilo interesantno čuti i vidjeti ilustracije konkretnih mjera i onih nekih koji mi još uvijek nismo ih razmatrali, a pogotovo ne implementirali. Evo, s obzirom da Kristijan će ostati još 10 minuta sa nama, a mi smo već po programu i prošli pauzu, ja predlažem da u narednih nekoliko minuta postavimo pitanja gospodinu Kristijanu, čujemo njegove odgovore, a nakon toga napravimo kratku pauzu od nekih 5 minuta i nakon toga nastavimo diskusiju do 11:30. Pa evo, ja ću da prođem kroz Q&A. Tamo imamo već nekih 9 pitanja. Od tih pitanja da vidimo koje bismo mogli adresirati gospodinu Kristijanu, s obzirom da imamo nekoliko pitanja koja se odnose na gender pitanja. Evo, ja bih onda uputio jedno okvirno pitanje u vezi s tim, pa da čujemo odgovor vezano za to. Dakle, da li prezentovane politike uključuju i principe EU Gender Equality Strategy 2020-2025?
I have to say that I don't know that for sure, but in general, I would assume that this is the case, because in all European projects that has to be considered. So that's that's all I can say. I have to admit that I didn't follow up on that.
Hvala na odgovoru. Sljedeće pitanje na koje možete dati svoj doprinos jeste: u kom obimu se pojavljuju slučajevi na sudu vezano za zagađivanje zraka u Europskoj uniji? Koliko je to čest slučaj i šta su obično presude? Ako sam ja dobro shvatio nekoliko pitanja koja imamo u Q&A. Hvala.
There are some ongoing cases against European member states for infringement of the Ambient Air Quality Directive. There have been already some verdicts against, I'm not sure, 2, 3, 4 countries, 2 or 4 member states for breaching and extended breaching of PM10 levels or NO2 levels, and for not having an air quality monitoring network according to the European directive. And but as this is a 3-stage process, it takes quite a lot of time. It takes many years until a verdict is published, has been found, and so it's a process that might be streamlined in future. But on national level, I think, especially in Germany, court laws or this, so the bringing the administration to court helped a lot to foster the implementation, for example, of low emission zones in Germany. So this was a strong driving force, the lawsuits by different citizens. So it helps, but it's a long-term process.
Hvala na odgovorima. Možda još jedno pitanje da sa vama podijelimo i onda s obzirom na vaše obaveze treba da idete. Pa evo pitanje kako se u drugim europskim državama ograničava emisija iz kućnih ložišta i da li se ograničava gradnja u smislu visine zgrada?
In Europe, all new appliances have to fulfill the so-called eco-design directive, the eco-design regulations, so with certain emission limit values. And then there are, in those countries where it's mostly of most importance, there are then on top of that, national regulations for maintenance, for subsidies, for inspections and things like that. Or for example, as it has been in Sweden, for large scale district heating, apply for district heating systems. And so these were mainly, these are mainly the two approaches. And then there of course are fuel quality standards, but this is certainly a sector which is not that much regulated on a European scale compared to vehicles. So this eco-design directive is relatively new, and before that it was mainly done on national or local or regional levels, for example, such as in Krakow, where they implemented a solid fuel ban. The same for Dublin, where they implemented also a ban since I think 20 years already now. And so, but the second question, I didn't quite get that. What the second part of the question, could you repeat that, please?
Pitanje je bilo da li postoje slučajevi ograničavanja visine kod novih zgrada.
Good question. I mean, I know that, I mean, this is regulated as far as I know strictly on national and local level. And I know it only from my hometown, Vienna, where there are restrictions for certain areas. So in certain areas, only up to a specific, buildings can only be up to a specific height. But I'm not a specialist in that. So this is the only general answer I can give.
Okay. Hvala Kristijane, želimo vam ugodan ostatak dana, a što se tiče nastavka našeg webinara, ja predlažem da sada napravimo pauzu malo kraću nego što smo originalno predvidjeli i da to bude do 10:55 i da onda nastavimo sa diskusijom. U međuvremenu, dok budemo na pauzi, možete ostati online, nemojte se odjavljivati i možete upisivati pitanja u Q&A box. Zamolio bih vas da pitanja postavljate na našem jeziku s obzirom da imamo prijevod, pa da ne bude prostora za možda moju interpretaciju pitanja i sl. Hvala vam i evo ponovo se vidimo i čujemo u 10:55. Dobar dan, ponovo nastavljamo, evo nas 10:56, dakle u ovom dijelu je predviđena diskusija, u Q&A boksu možete postavljati pitanja, trenutno imamo 11 pitanja, zahvaljujem se svima koji su postavili ta pitanja, na neka smo već djelomično odgovorili, na neka nismo, a evo gledajući po pitanjima, dakle već ste i razvili jednu vrstu diskusije, komentarišete pitanja, što je jako dobro. Pa evo, ako mogu da primijetim, imamo nekoliko pitanja za nas, dakle za nas koji vodimo ovaj dio u izradi strategije zaštite okoliša. Pa prvo pitanje, s obzirom da je evidentan nedostatak monitoring mreže kvaliteta zraka, da li će strategija identificirati potrebu donošenja metodologije određivanja lokacija monitoring stanica. Ono što treba naglasiti prilikom izrade strategije zaštite okoliša primjenjuje se participatorni pristup, dakle za razliku od nekog tradicionalnog pristupa u Bosni i Hercegovini gdje jedna grupa stručnjaka nešto napiše pa onda sve zainteresirane strane to komentarišu. U ovom slučaju se radi na način da od početka su predstavnici zainteresiranih strana uključeni i zajedno sa voditeljima pojedinih tema kreiraju kako ciljeve, tako isto i same mjere. Tako da, s obzirom na identificirani izazov, ne sumnjam da će rezultat rada već narednog sastanka radne grupe za kvalitet zraka biti da ćemo predložiti ovakvu jednu mjeru. Dakle, identificirali smo kao izazov, kao problem u postojećem stanju nedovoljno razvijenu mrežu za kvalitet zraka, a onda kroz mjeru ćemo preporučiti i precizirati do kojeg nivoa treba ta mreža da se razvije. Naravno, u saradnji sa svim članovima grupe na participativnom pristupu. Također još sam primijetio nekih pitanja koja se odnose za nas, da li će strategija uzeti u obzir nove ciljeve koji su postavljeni koji se postavljaju u EU. Ne znam na koje konkretne ciljeve se misli, da li u oblasti smanjenja emisija zagađujućih materija ili emisije stakleničkih gasova, ali kao što sam odgovorio na ovo prethodno pitanje, sve je do radne grupe. Dakle, ne može voditelj, dakle ni ja ni Goran, da kažemo hoćemo uzeti ove ciljeve ili nećemo uzeti ciljeve, neke određene ciljeve u smislu kvantitativnog smanjenja emisije ili kvantitativnog poboljšanja nekog od aspekata kvaliteta zraka. Tako da, ponavljam, to je stvar za diskusiju u radnim grupama. Također, jedno pitanje koje se odnosi na situaciju u Bosni i Hercegovini je da li ima ikakvog napretka u ispunjavanju obaveza Bosne i Hercegovine prema SLR-TAP-u, dakle Konvencije o prekograničnom zagađivanju i kreiranju PRTR-a, makar na subnacionalnom nivou. Vjerovatno se misli na nivou entiteta. I kao dodatni komentar na ovo pitanje, CEI je vrlo aktivan na tom polju u Švedskoj, pa se nadam da će biti u mogućnosti krenuti neke od aktivnosti u ovom smislu i u Bosni i Hercegovini. Prema mojim saznanjima, mislim sad relativno je šta je napredak, šta nije, ali bih zaključio da nema nekog značajnijeg napretka, neke aktivnosti su u pripremi, pa ćemo vidjeti. Što se tiče ostalih pitanja koja se odnose na nas, mislim da je to i sad možemo da pređemo na ova preostala pitanja. Evo, počet ću od pitanja za gospodina Tamistea. Kaže, tokom provedbe mjera energijske efikasnosti u stambenom sektoru i prelaska na čistije tehnologije grijanja, kolika je bila podrška države u smislu sufinansiranja ovih programa, računajući financijska sredstva Estonije, EU, Norveške i sl. A koliko su učestvovali građani? Može odgovor i u prosječnim procentima učešća. Da li su posticaji od strane države bili važni i neophodni u smislu ubrzavanja procesa uvođenja zelenih tehnologija i poboljšanja kvaliteta zraka? Malo duže pitanje, ali evo nadam se da ste razumjeli. Izvolite.
Yes, thank you. If I understood correctly, and you were asking, what was the percentage of the government subsidy, then actually it was even up to 85% of the total investment. It could vary, that in some of the smaller districts it was higher, and in bigger district heating districts, because the economies of scale and the efficiency was higher, the share of support was lower. But yeah, it was it could be between 40 and 85%. So it was relatively high share of support. And it was mostly directed towards companies, this district heating part. So district heating companies, most of them were owned municipally. So municipality, local governments owned the heating, but in the beginning, but now most of those district heating regions have been privatized, and they are owned by companies. Obviously, private sector was more interested in starting from bigger cities where you have lots of customers and a good, decent network, and mostly the problematic small ones, these nobody wanted to buy, and these were managed by municipalities. And now what is happening is that now that most of the boiler houses have been switched, then actually government started also giving support from exiting from district heating. If you have only a very small municipality, you have a schoolhouse and 4 apartment houses. Nowadays, heat pumps and micro solutions could be more efficient than keeping the lines where you have the energy losses. So it was historically a different process, that you started out with big subsidies for companies or municipality owned, and then started going also switching out the district heating. And then towards the private citizens, it was only later such programs started, but there have been programs. But as I was explaining, they are very often related to also energy efficiency. And there the support has been, let's say, between 40 to 60% of the total investment.
Hvala na odgovoru. Mislim da je poentirano u smislu pitanja, dakle dat je odgovor. Što se tiče ostalih pitanja, s obzirom da je prethodno odgovorio gospodin Lauri, a imamo jedno pitanje koje se upravo odnosi na primjer Estonije, samo dok nađem, nisam još posložio pitanja, pa malo potraje. Dakle, da li je Estonija osigurala National Gender Responsive Adaptation and Mitigation Planning?
Well, I mean, being an EU member, obviously all the requirements and the guidelines for putting together national policies, we need to follow them. But I would say that's a difference between, following the requirements on paper and then if you are really good at delivering them. I would say, I remember I started working in the Ministry of Economy in 2004, and there was already back then, there was questions. Does this program that you're planning help to, improve the gender balance, IT society, and the environment? These were kind of three key kind of principles that you had to kind of evaluate each program or activity that we're doing. And obviously there was some assessment, hey, how does it, but it wasn't in depth. And I would say there's now, I think the EU level, there's much more emphasis on seriously integrating these principles. And I would say Estonia wasn't very good, I think, on these gender issues, because if you look at the facts, Estonia has still high wage gap. Difference between wage for men and women, it's quite big, and it hasn't closed. Estonia hasn't closed the gap. So I would say I think this is an area where Estonia actually needs to improve. Now for the programming for the 2021 and 2027 kind of structured fund programs, Estonia is currently putting together the strategy. So it's a little bit kind of early to say how good Estonia is this time in terms of strategic planning, but I think over next 4 months, Estonia should present the plan, and then we can see how well it is integrated or not. But I would say so far, it has been not very good.
Hvala na odgovoru i na elaboraciji. Sljedeće pitanje koje smo upravo dobili također se tiče primjera Estonije, pa evo da iskoristimo priliku dok je Lauri sa uključenim mikrofonom. Koliko procentualno učestvuju nuklearne elektrane u proizvodnji električne energije u Estoniji?
Zero. So Estonian electricity, what is important, I think, for Estonia is that the biggest change has been opening liberalization of energy market. This was one condition when we joined the EU. It was condition we open our energy markets, and number two, that we connect to our neighbors. So European Union financed building new interconnection to Finland. And then in 2009, Estonia joined the Nordic-Baltic power market, meaning now we have all the Nordic countries, Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark, and Estonia, and the Baltics, Latvia, Lithuania, interconnected in electricity markets. And this was huge, because now we can rely on energy trading. We don't have to have all the capacity domestically. And what is important now, what Estonia benefits from the low carbon and relatively cheap energy from Nordics, like hydro power, like nuclear in Sweden and Finland, and lots of wind from Denmark and Nordic countries. But so this is one part, was that integrating power markets, tremendous change, hugely important for decarbonization of, but also locally, what has changed, we started out 100% producing electricity from oil shale, which you remember very dirty. But government introduced renewable subsidies in 2007. And what happened was that Estonia had the fastest increase of renewable electricity production in the whole European Union. And now what happened, 2007, we started, and actually 2016, Estonia already fulfilled 2020 goals. Estonia was the first EU member state, one of the first to meet 2020 targets in terms of share of renewables. And what that allowed was actually to sell our renewable statistics to countries who are not meeting the targets. That's the kind of statistical transfer mechanism in EU. So Estonia benefited economically. We sold for more than 100 million euros statistics to Luxembourg and other countries. And we invested that revenue again into these programs, energy efficiency, better street lighting, all this kind of environmental friendly. So kind of cutting the emissions fast created economic income. So multiple things, increasing renewables. And now the next, we had just a new government in Estonia starting in January. And in their coalition agreement, now they said that they want by 2035 to stop electricity production from fossils. So not 2050, but 2035. And for that, they want to kind of make Estonia offshore wind hub or, center. Because now there's a kind of racial competition between Nordic and Baltic countries, and the government wants to push for building that the offshore parks would be connected, big parks, kind of 1,000, 2,000 megawatt parks would be built in Estonia, and they want to kind of create a framework for that. So for years and years, it was like, oh, EU is forcing us to do renewables, but now government is saying, no, this is our economic strategy. We want to do the renewables because it's also employment, it's also jobs, it's also export of clean energy. So there has been a mental shift of thinking.
Hvala Lauri na opsežnom odgovoru i mislim da upravo iz ovog odgovora možemo izvući neke lekcije, pouke i za Bosnu i Hercegovinu, jer u baselineu se nalazimo skoro na istoj situaciji kao i Estonija, a upravo kroz dekarbonizaciju možemo postići razvoj. Bilo je pokušaja korištenja upravo ovog mehanizma statističkog transfera i u Bosni i Hercegovini. Možemo i to koristiti s obzirom da smo članica energetske zajednice, ali evo još uvijek nismo uspjeli, pa nadam se da ćemo, zahvaljujući iskustvima Estonije, možemo o tome malo i više razgovarati, naravno mimo ovog webinara, pa da vidimo šta se tu može uraditi. Što se tiče ostalih pitanja, imali smo još jedno u međuvremenu. Ja bih Eleni postavio ovo pitanje koje je postavljeno i Kristijanu, ali naravno da čujemo mišljenje njeno vezano za ograničavanje emisija iz kućnih ložišta. Kakva su njena iskustva, pogotovo u regionu, kad govorimo o zemljama ne samo Zapadnog Balkana, nego generalno bivšeg istočnog bloka, i da li ona ima iskustava u vezi prostornog planiranja u tom smislu, ograničavanja nove izgradnje, nekih ograničenja ili usmjeravanja novogradnje u urbanim centrima. Eleni, izvoli.
Thank you. So with the countries that we have engaged with so far, this is something that appears as a priority for them, I would say overall, but it can be prioritized in a different way. For some countries, it can be very high, a very high priority and a very, very immediate priority, but also it is something that some countries can act quite fast on, provided that the frameworks are in place, that the infrastructure is in place, and that the dialogue between the stakeholders, the different stakeholders, has already happened. In other cases, it is part of their immediate plans, so or their future plans, as I was showing you in the timeline. Sometimes this is something that they will be targeting for 2025. This is something that they might have to push back in time or even work on sooner. But I think that it always depends on the national context. It depends on the national priorities and the advice of the experts, the needs, the social needs that need to be covered, and what the country is ready to put in place. So it always appears as part of the mitigation options, or as part of the solutions, and we always need to consider and assess what is best, which is what we do through the communication and the collaboration with the national experts. Thank you.
Hvala Eleni na odgovoru. Mislim da je bilo još jedno pitanje, a tiče se ponovo primjera Estonije. Očito da je primjer Estonije izazvao veliko interesovanje. Pitanje, mislim da se tiče fondova, da. Naime, gospodin Lauri je spomenuo u izlaganju da je Estonija koristila norveške fondove, pa pitanje u tom smislu je koje je Estonija iskoristila norveške fondove, može li BiH aplicirati za te norveške fondove? Pitanje za Laurija.
Yes, so I was just trying to look up some numbers on the website about the Norwegian funds. For example, in the last period, this is the European, economic area program that Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway have to fund because they want to access the European economic area. And I'm looking at the number, for example, for Estonia, the total funding was 68 million euros in 2014 to 2021. So it's quite significant. And I remember that, these countries that are funding these programs, they usually in cooperation with the member state then define the priorities. And for Norway funding, I remember the priorities were like IT and digital innovation and environment, and then kind of sustainability and social issues. So I would say I don't have the exact numbers, but historically these have been tens of millions going into environment. I remember that. Quite a lot of this monitoring and environmental kind of assessment type of infrastructure was a significant part of that Norway grant.
Hvala. Imamo još nekoliko pitanja za odgovoriti. U međuvremenu imamo jednu sugestiju. Sugerišemo da ESAP projekat u obziri rezultate impact projekta podrška monitoringu kvaliteta zraka koji se realizira u BiH. Hvala na sugestiji i svakako kroz radnu grupu preporučujemo da istrajete, mislim da preporučite to i na samom sastanku. Još je bio jedan komentar na pitanje, dakle da strategija treba da sadrži i konkretne mjere i rokove, dakle akcioni plan. Nismo to naglasili, ali oni koji su do sada učestvovali na sastancima radnih grupa znaju da strategija sadrži i akcioni plan koji onda definiše ciljeve sa konkretnim mjerama i rokovima. Dakle, samo u tom smislu pojašnjenje. A evo, diskusija ide malo u smjeru energetskog bilansa Estonije, pa sljedeće pitanje je koliko električne energije Estonija proizvede, a koliko uveze u toku godine. Samo neki procentualni odnos.
Because now it is market-based, this can change from year to year. For example, in 2016-17, Estonia was producing more than we consumed. So we were exporting. We were selling energy to Latvia and Finland. But in 2019, electricity production in Estonia decreased by almost 40%. So we started importing, and this was because the CO2 price and in emission trading system went up. So for years, the CO2 price in this emission trading system was like 5, 6, 7, 8 euros and so on. So it wasn't giving the price signal. But when it went to 20 euro, then oil shale electricity in Estonia wasn't competitive on a regional power market. And now Estonia is importing mostly. And that is also one of the reasons why, you know, government is understanding that there's no economic future for oil shale electricity. We need to start investing into wind parks and solar and clean capacities, because then we would have energy for ourselves, but also for selling at the Nordic power market. So really it depends on CO2 price, and a little bit also kind of, you know, outages. For example, if there's a big nuclear capacity going out in Nordics for maintenance, then oil shale is competitive to fill that kind of gap. But other than that, it's very CO2 price driven now.
Hvala, Lauri. Da se vratimo malo konkretnije, dublje na pitanja kvaliteta zraka, a u tom smislu pitanje za Eleni. Naveli ste primjer Atine, interesantan primjer iz Atine vezano za poboljšanje kvaliteta zraka, pa ono što je kod nas vjerovatno jedan od aspekata gdje možda neki nivoi ne odgovore na najbolji način, jeste uključivanje javnosti. Kako da pridobijemo javnost za one mjere za koje smo se odlučili da provodimo. Pa možete li nam u tom smislu dati kratak osvrt iz vašeg iskustva? Pogotovo kada su u pitanju neke mjere koje se tiču ograničenog pristupa nekim dijelovima grada ili zabrane za ulazak motornih vozila u neke dijelove grada. Obično su tu, barem kod nas, ljudi vrlo nerado podržavaju takve mjere.
Thank you. I would like to connect the example of Athens to another example in Bristol. So I'm currently living in Bristol. Something that I don't think happened to the extent that it should have happened in Athens was early engagement with the public and early consultation with the public. So in Bristol, when the mayor was developing the clean air strategy, and there were plans to start implementing pedestrianization of roads and new cycle routes, new bikes, more bikes, and this change in how we drive in the city and how we live in the city, there was a very long period of consultation, and it was extremely inclusive in the sense that there were representatives from all the groups that live and experience the city. So there were student representatives, university representatives, representatives from marginalized communities, minorities, and this dialogue really helped map and identify issues that every team, every member of the community, or at least to the extent that it was possible, it helped identify those key issues that the different groups in the city would experience. It was important because they were the ones that would be implementing the change. This type of participatory design that then leads to the behavior change, that then leads to changing how we walk in the city, how we move in the city. It was important to map and identify from the beginning, and this did happen. And I must say that it's very different when I compare this to Athens, because in the Great Walk occasion, the project itself was rolled back. But we've had other occasions in Athens where other measures were implemented. For example, the electric bikes or the electric scooters. This was implemented in another city as well. But these measures, they did not have a long-term effect. They did not have a long-term impact. And that comes with an associated cost behind that, because if it is not taken up by the public, if for whatever reason the public thinks that this is not appropriate to them or for them, this is something that the experts need to know, this is something that the policymakers need to know, and this is something that needs to be addressed in the best way for the local context. So I genuinely don't think that what happened in Bristol and the type of change that happened here could have been implemented in Athens, because our culture is different, our way of engaging with the city is different. So this is why I wanted to share that with you, because while the multiple benefits of that, the health, the cycling, the environment, the air pollution, these can be understood and these can be communicated, it is also important to understand the circumstances of the citizens who are experiencing the city and are engaging with the city in their everyday lives. And I think Bristol did a very good job in mapping that and including that into their plans.
Hvala Eleni na odgovoru i pojašnjenju. Imamo još neki 3 minute do kraja oficijelno onog programa koji smo dobili. Nemamo više pitanja u boksu Q&A. Ako imate još neko pitanje, može nešto kratko. Do tada ja bih kao moderator samo da naglasim možda neko pitanje kojeg se nismo dotakli, a iz iskustva znam da je u Bosni i Hercegovini kritično vezano za poboljšanje kvaliteta zraka, a to su ljudski kapaciteti, dakle kapaciteti koje imaju institucije koje se bave ili koje bi se trebale baviti ovim pitanjima. Pa na jednom od slajdova Lauri je upravo pokazao koje su to sve institucije koje su od početka 1990. godina pa na ovamo radile na projektima, na implementaciji, prvo na osmišljavanju, onda i na implementaciji mjera. Pa u vezi s tim pitanje, otprilike, ne mora to sad biti tačan broj, ali koliko ljudi ima primarni zadatak u Estoniji da se bavi pitanjima poboljšanja kvaliteta zraka i kako daju doprinos ostali sektori. Na primjer, kako se uključuje Ministarstvo unutrašnjih poslova, kako Ministarstvo saobraćaja pomaže agencijama čija je to primarna nadležnost. Pa molim samo kratak, što kraći odgovor, iako je pitanje zahtjevno.
Was this question to me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So I would say, Estonia is a small country, and that is both a minus and a plus. I think the big plus of being small is that you have to be kind of fast, and you have a small networks. Few key people, if they cooperate well, then things start happening. But you have small resources. I would say people, if you look at the ministry side, there's the Department of Air Quality, I think it's less than 10 people. And they do EU legislation, local legislation, funding programs, national strategies. So less than 10 people. I was the director of Energy Department in the Ministry of Economy. I had 8 people to do national energy policy and EU policy and all that. So, and EU presidency, Estonia held 2017. So, and then you have, I think, for example, environmental board who is doing the permits and supervision. I think there you have also kind of 10 people additionally, and then environmental agency who is doing the monitoring and analysis and statistics and so on. There's 5 to 6 people. And then at the funding agency where I also work, we had 90 people for 10 areas of kind of managing, controlling, payments, compliance, everything, programming, and yet, let's say again, less than 10 people for funding of air quality related projects. So it's, you have to do fast. And I think important part was technology. Estonia is very good at e-government solutions. If you do smart kind of systems where you can online fill in reports from companies, regarding if you're doing the permit applications, not on paper, but digital, if you're doing the funding applications, everything is digital, we didn't accept anymore on paper applications for projects. So this speeds up, and you can do with a smaller amount of people. And now there's also machine learning, artificial intelligence, who can do the checks and compliances. So it even online, it doesn't have to be people, but rather the machines and algorithms are checking and saying, hey, something doesn't add up in the numbers, please look manually on this application, for example. So these are the things that, if you're good people, smart design and good use of technology, you can do already a lot. You don't need to hire 500 people to implement it. I think if you hire 500 people, you're moving more slowly, because then people start inventing jobs for themselves, or you start having coordination problems. And then cooperation with other ministries. It was a problem, definitely. I think in the 1990s, in the beginning, everybody was focused to create the system out of chaos. There was nothing, zero. There was no, kind of organizational structures, legal basis. So everybody was focusing on their stuff. But I think once the basics was kind of built, then it started, hey, but I need your help, or I need you to change this thing. And in the beginning, it was hard. I think kind of Ministry of Economy, Ministry of Environment, they had very different views, perhaps, on these issues. But I think kind of it takes time to start, and also then there was created, for example, administrative coordinating structure. Prime Minister's office created kind of coordinating top officials body, and they discussed everything. Kind of when there was a problem between ministries, they tried to solve it. Kind of top civil service level. So it's a it's a process, but yeah, I think there are kind of few simple rules that can help a little bit.
Hvala Lauri na vrlo korisnim informacijama i za nas, za Bosnu i Hercegovinu i sve nivoe vlasti. Evo,
profesore, ja se izvinjavam što upadam. Imamo 3 podignute ruke, pa bih ja predložila da kolege iz tehničke službe pruže priliku da se jave. Ukoliko to nije bilo greškom, moguće da nisu uspjeli da napišu pitanje u chatu. Tako da bi ja predložila da damo priliku gospođi Dušici Pešević da se javi. Izvolite, gospođo Dušice. Ovo je možda bilo greškom. Također imali smo podignutu ruku od Nirhe Kozice. Izvolite, gospođo Nirha, ako imate pitanje, slobodno možete se sad javiti. Ništa. Ovo je vjerovatno bilo slučajno, tako da nemamo više ni podignutih ruku. To je to. Ja sam htjela samo da provjerim, ali vidim da je ovo očito bila greška, tako da možemo.
Hvala. Hvala Nadira. Dakle, svima je bilo omogućeno. Ako niste mogli u Q&A-u, bio je i chat, a evo na ovaj način smo htjeli da omogućimo da se uključite, što bi se reklo, uživo. U svakom slučaju, hvala vam na učešću. Evo, do kraja smo došli sa 104 učesnika, u jednom trenutku je bilo, čini mi se, oko 115, tako da drago nam je da je odziv bio ovako dobar. I za kraj, kao neki zaključak, mogu da konstatujem da smo čuli jako dobrih primjera, ne samo pored onog opšteg pristupa planiranju kvaliteta zraka, isto tako i konkretnih primjera. Iako konkretne mjere mi manje više znamo, ali smo naučili neke stvari, čuli, teško je naučiti za jedan webinar, ali čuli smo kako odgovoriti nekim ključnim aspektima provođenja tih mjera, kako uključiti sve zainteresirane strane, kako dobiti podršku i opšte javnosti, ali i drugih resora. Posebno i kroz pitanja se pokazalo da je primjer Estonije jako koristan, tako da evo, vjerovatno je zaključak, a složit ćete se vjerovatno s tim, da u nastavku i izrade strategije, ali i mimo strategije imamo pomoć onih koji su radili na strategiji zaštite okoliša Estonije i koji su postigli, evo, kao što smo vidjeli, veoma mjerljive rezultate. Iskoristit ću priliku da najavim i treću radionicu radne grupe za temu kvalitet zraka, klimatske promjene i energiju, koja će se održati krajem marta, pa evo ja vas sve pozivam da uzmete učešća na tom sastanku i nadam se da ovo što smo danas čuli i što smo prodiskutovali, da će vam dati dodatnu vrijednost da učestvujete aktivno na ne samo sljedećoj radionici, sljedećem sastanku radne grupe, nego i na svim preostalim i da ćete aktivno do kraja učestvovati na izradi i strategije i akcionog plana. Hvala vam i evo do narednog susreta. Želim vam ugodan ostatak dana. Doviđenja.